Dobrý večer.
Good evening. I wish you a pleasant evening. My name is Michal Hvorecký. Ladies and gentlemen, I have got just information about interpretation channels. If you need interpretation, it's number 6 and 7. These are those numbers. They are displayed there. Slovak, English, and Russian. There are several interpreters working behind the stage for you tonight. Thank you very much for coming. So what's ahead of us tonight? We have discussed it with our distinguished guest, Mrs. Ulitskaya, coming from Moscow, Russia. That first I will introduce her, her life and her works. Then we will have a short reading, which will only be available in Slovak and Russian. And then it will be followed by a short discussion. We will be talking about the literature as well as many other things, and I would like to give floor to you afterwards if you have any questions to our renowned author, so we will be given the opportunity. So let's get to the bottom line. And Mrs. Ulitskaya also agreed that she will be more than pleasant to sign her books. It's her first visit to Slovakia. Those of us who love her books, her readings, and literature are very pleased. The publishing house called Slovard has brought copies of 3 books they have published, so you will have this opportunity at the end of this event. You can get a signed copy. This is the last event of the Central European Forum this year. It's an event which has significantly changed Bratislava and has significantly contributed to a deeper, broader intellectual discourse, and I'm very happy that it's also already dedicated to literature, among other things. So we had Bernard Schenke with us in the past. Mrs. Ulitskaya was born in 1942 in Bashkirsk. Looking at the map of the Soviet Union, it's east of Moscow. Perhaps the city of Ufa rings the bell, south of Perm. Why the Republic of Bashkirsk? Because her family was evacuated there during the Second World War, where the fascists, Nazis, were approaching Moscow. But after the war, they came back to Moscow. She studied genetics at the Moscow State University and worked for the Russian Academy of Sciences. She considers herself as an evolutionist. She studies the origin and the evolution of humankind, and she thinks that her literature and writing is another form of studying who is a man. Why she is not involved in science any longer? Because she was caught red-handed when copying books in the samizdat form. She was fired. She claims always being an anti-Soviet woman. She has never come back to traditional professions. She started writing plays for theater. During the Soviet regime, she could not publish. She was not willing to publish even, and her novels and short stories were only published after the collapse of the Soviet Union. In Slovakia, we are lucky because many of her books have been already translated into Slovak. It's a great blessing for us who love good quality literature. Perhaps I should mention that Sonička was the first book. It's a novel and 2 short stories. It was translated by Vladimir Čerevka. Then Kaligram published Media and Her Children. It was translated by Katarina Strelkova, and then translations by Štrasser and the publishing house Slovard, which has been taken care of her books in the Slovak language very well. The first book was published in French. It was Sonička, which was first published in in French and then in Russian. In Russia, it was published in the newspaper called Nový Mír. So today we have Daniel Stein, interpreter, the funeral party, the great green tent. She has amassed numerous rewards and prizes. She is extremely popular, for example, in Germany. And Mrs. Ulitskaya, in addition to her writing, also dedicates a lot of efforts to numerous civic activities. She considers herself a person who is very sensitive of the state, who is quite suspicious and critical of any regime. She believes that's also one of the roles of writers. I'm sure she will touch upon that. Her books touch upon the great tradition of Russian epic, as well as the tradition and procedures of post-documentary novel. Sometimes she refers to herself as a slave of documentary books. She follows documentary books and archives, and definitely she is into the letter form. Her heroes write a lot of letters to each other, and once you get involved in reading their letters, you can't stop. And I'm sure that we will talk about her political engagement, her opinion of the current Russian regime and power. We'll see. Mrs. Ulitskaya would like to rather speak about literature than politics, but it's it's very difficult to differentiate between or separate her literature from politics. But these are, I believe, very intertwined. If you have not discovered her books, please do it. But I believe that many of you are already her fans due to translators and publishing house in Slovakia. We are lucky and we can read her books in Slovak. And perhaps we should start with a short reading from Jacob's Ladder, which has been recently published in Slovak.
Кусочек будет маленький. Лекция была вдохновляющей. Одни только имена каковы. Ницше, Айседора Дункан, Жак Далькросс, ритмы мира, ритмы тела. И все эти ритмы зашифрованы в музыке, которая сама по себе есть отражение пульса космического. О создании нового человека путем слушания и воспроизведения этих космических ритмов Маруся пока еще не успела узнать.
Unfortunately, this book has not been translated into English, or maybe it has been translated but has not published in English yet, and that's why you are not provided with the official interpreting of this reading. Thank you for your understanding.
Но событие, самое главное, может быть, главнейшее в жизни произошло в день, когда Элла Ивановна прочитала свою последнюю лекцию и провела под музыку демонстрацию. Она сменила свой мужественный костюм на белый короткий хитон. В движениях ее не было ничего балетного. Свобода и энергия, естественность и смелость – это мое, это совершенно мое, почувствовала Маруся всем своим телом. После лекции она летела домой, как на крыльях. Походка ее изменилась в 1 час. Спина выпрямилась, плечи опустились. Длинная шея как будто еще удлинилась, а ступни легко скользили по земле, как по льду.
Jakubov rebrík v preklade Jana Štrasera.
Jacob's Ladder, translation by Jan Štrasser.
Už len tie mená.
The lecture was inspiring. Sorry, this is again
Rytmy sveta.
this is again the text in Slovak,
Rytmy sú zašifrované v hudbe, ktorá
the translation into Slovak.
Počúvaním a reprodukovaním tých kozmických rytmov sa Marusia zatiaľ ešte nestihla dozvedieť o stvorení nového človeka? No už čoskoro. Čoskoro. Pravda, že o tom Marusia snívala. Stať sa takým novým, slobodným, rozmýšľajúcim a cítiacim človekom. Novou ženou. A pomáhať iným ísť tou cestou. tušenie nádhernej premeny. No tá najdôležitejšia udalosť možno v celom jej živote sa odohrala v deň, keď Ela Ivanovna uviedla svoju poslednú prednášku a demonstrovala ju za sprievodu hudby. Zamenila svoj mužský odev za krátky biely chytón. V jej pohyboch nebolo nič baletné. Sloboda a energia, prirodzenosť a odvaha. Toto chcem. To je presne to, čo chcem. Pocítila Marusia celým svojim telom. Po prednáške letela domov ako na krídlach, jej chôdza sa zmenila v okamihu. Chrbát sa vystrel, plecia klesli, dlhá šia ako by sa predĺžila a chodidlá sa ľahko klzali po zemi ako po ľade. Mama už spala. Otec sedel v nočnej čiapke pri pretrlejke, čítal akúsi starú francúzsku knihu a Marusia sa nemala s kým podeliť o radosť, o novotu, ba až o určité opojenie. Ľahla si v rožnej izbe, niekdejšej komore, zdalo sa jej, že nezaspí, no zaspala okamžite. Vstala zavčasu. Do studenej vody kvapla trocha voňavky brokar, darček od myšu, absolvovala svoju švajčiarsku toaletu, navliekla si nové nohavičky, vzala do ruky šnurovačku, no hneď ju aj odhodila. Už nikdy si nebude sťahovať telo tou ohavnosťou, staromódnou ohavnosťou, lebo jej telo od včera chcelo byť slobodné, nie zovreté, nie zošnurované, ale pružné, antické, grécke. Obliekla si staré orieškové šaty, no škaredý kabát si nedala. Natiahla si obnosené sako, nasadila si okrúhlu kožušinovú čiapku, zhora ju previazala šatkou, pozrela sa na seba do zrkadla, zapáčila sa sama sebe a pomyslela si, ale je tá Marusia krásna. A zasmiala sa, lebo si dobre pamätala, ktorá z obľúbených hrdiniek Tolstého to povedala, keď sa tešila z jary a z mladosti. Bolo 10 hodín, keď vyšla z domu. Vonko bolo slnečno, no dosť chladno. Vrátil sa jej včerajší pocit ľahkosti a slobody a usmiela sa na včerajší deň. No vysvetlo, že sa neusmieva na včerajšok, ale na mladého muža, ktorý stal pri výklade ich hodinárstva. Bol kučeravý, trochu doryšava, v študentskej brigadírke a v plášti. A jeho tvár, akási povedomá, vyžarovala takú istú radosť, aká naplňala Marusiu. Maria, už som ani nedúfal, že vás stretnem. Spomente si, boli sme na Rachmaninovom koncerte. A hoci odvtedy prešiel už takmer mesiac, Marusia si spomenula. Zaraz si spomenula na študenta, ktorý jej ponúkol miesto na prízemí a potom ju odprevadil domov. Zapôsobil vtedy dojmom dobre vychovaného mladého muža. Aj teraz sa správal veľmi zdvorilo. Smiem vás odprevadiť? Spýtal sa a ponúkol jej rameno. Rukáv čierneho plášťa bol z jemnej, drahej látky. Kam? Marusia vlastne ani nevedela, kam sa vybrala. Cvičenia s deťmi v ten deň nemala a do prednášky boli ešte 2 hodiny. Vykročili a šli, kam ich oči viedli. Toľko krátka ukážka z Jakubovho rebríčka.
So this was a short reading from Jacob's letter.
A teraz, ak nerozumiete,
And if some of you do not understand Russian or perhaps forgot how to speak Russian or understand Russian, please take your headphones and we are going to have a discussion with our guest. This short excerpt has manifested or demonstrated various things that are quite typical of your writing. Jacob's letter is the book partly inspired by your family history. Could you please speak something about or say something about your family, because it could be used to illustrate the history of Europe of the last 200 years. It shows that the family is of extreme importance for you, and it also shows that your family relationships are very much alive. In this case, I am no exception. Each family is a small bubble, transparent or mirror-like, which reflects the entire history of the family. And in the history of each family, also the history of the country is reflected. Based on this book, many people started to take interest in the history of their own families and tried to learn as much as they could. This really is the history of Marussia, or Marussia is the history of my family, but in fact it is highly concentrated. I discovered it thanks to the letters, because otherwise much of the history of my ancestors would be unknown, would remain unknown, and much of what I have learned was very unpleasant, and I also had to consult the archives of KGB, where I found the name of my grandfather. It evoked fear because of this tremendous and very terrifying force. People sometimes act in a proper manner, sometimes not. And we knew very little about the grandfather because grandma divorced from him, and my father had very bitter relationships with his father, and I only learned about the reason after I consulted the KGB files. It was not only a skeleton in the closet, it was something more. And I was very glad that I was able to go through it, because I started to better understand my own family, my own country. There were also some other interesting moments. My grandpa Jacob, who was practically never mentioned, proved to be a great, heroic, talented person. And another thing that was very pleasant to see was that I take allegedly after him. And when I started reading his books, his diaries, I came across the lists of various tasks or of the things he would have to do next year, or the books that he would have to get. But since I was very young when he died, I was not able to be with him or to spend with him more time. But it seems that genetics do work, and many things are simply inherited. And I would, if I inherited more from him, I would be an even better human being. But there is also a very big number of other ancestors whom I do not know. Reading the book, you may be sometimes terrified because of the things that you find in it. If you look for your ancestors, you will find them. The migration waves have been here for at least 1,000 years, and that there is no pure line. We are all mixed. We all carry in us the elements of old substances, quintessence of human and history of humanity. I'm really very fond of the subject that I studied, genetics, because it shows how the flow of genes perpetrates the generations. I have friends. In my family, I also have a boy. His name is Pierre. He lives in Paris. He is also a relation of ours, but he is a very distant relative. Some of it is also mentioned in the book. I'm trying to find out how the humankind is uniform, or to what extent is it blended and intermingled. You speak in your book about a conflict which evolves, but let me go back to not to the literary family, but to your real family, because one of your ancestors fought in a Turkish-Russian war. But after the Bolshevik Revolution, the history was very harsh on your family. Both your grandfathers were sent to gulags, and you suffered harassment from the Soviet regime. Yet your book reflects a very deep relationship to Russia, to what is Russian. Was it because of the influence of your family? It is a cultural phenomenon. The culture of Russia, the Russian culture, is not my only culture. I am a Jew, and my Jewish substance is, so to say, genetic. The only language that I live with is Russian. Jews love writing. Jews are people of literature. In every culture you look, Jews are writers. You have writers of different nationalities, but of Jewish origin. And since the Russian culture is my only culture, it is simply unthinkable for me to separate from it, to break the links with it. So I want to spend the rest of my life in Russia. One of my ancestors was there when Plevna in Bulgaria was occupied. At that time, young boys of 10 or 11 years were taken to military schools. Some of them were, we are speaking about Jewish boys, some of them were baptized, and the relative that I speak about served 25 years in the army. It was in the 1860s and 1870s. We have pictures of him wearing a yarmulka.
И мы с моим одним немецким
when I talked to a friend from Germany, we came to the conclusion that there is a similarity between us because we are a generation that doesn't want to speak about the history and the things, or it is because there is a fear of speaking up in the Soviet regime. It was a feeling of a Soviet person to speak up one's mind. It is an even physiological feeling, and it's a very long process to get rid of this fear. It is not possible to do it by enacting legislation that from now on we are not going to be afraid. It is similar to a physiological pain. For example, if an animal hears a strange sound, it is scared, and so are people. But the limits of fear, or the thresholds of fear, such as or the same as the thresholds of pain, differ. In the Soviet Union, it was very high. This threshold was set at a very high level. Everybody was afraid of everybody else. People would be afraid of their neighbors. They would be afraid to speak their mind. There were several generations that were raised in fear. The new generation is more or less liberated from such fear because they face other problems and they are not in the grips of fear so much as we were. And regarding the family history, the interest in the history of families will grow increasing. This is very important for taking lessons from one's past, to learn about how one's parents, grandparents lived, and how the social environment in which they lived was reflected in their lives. The environment does shape or does have an impact on the person, and the role of the environment, of the genetics is not quite well studied yet, but the science today tries to establish how the family, the culture, and also the legacy is.
Still, the Soviet culture and society has produced people who were not scared, who overcome their fear. One of your close friends who attended the Central European Forum, who faced and opposed the occupation in Czechoslovakia, is a heroine you wrote about. Could you tell us more about her, what she meant to you? Because the topic of friendship, in addition to family, is among the topics you cover in your books. You said that friendship has helped you to survive the Soviet regime. You have so many friends, especially in Moscow, in the Moscow community. The relationship between the Soviet Union and Czechoslovakia, or rather the Russian Federation and the Slovak Republic, now are quite complicated. Was the year 1968 traumatic to you as much as it was traumatic to us? Was it a sort of milestone in your work? You know, the year 1968 was extremely important milestone in my life. Not only here, I am talking mainly speaking for myself mainly. I was studying postgraduate studies in the field of genetics. Gorbanevskaya went to the Red Square. At that time I was in the city of Uzhgorod, not far from here. And I had no idea that the Russian troops, Soviet troops, came to Prague. But when I saw airplanes flying over my head, I thought the Third World War was starting. Nothing else I could think of. I was looking at the airplanes, and that's what I thought of. I thought, you know, the airplanes are flying, you have to go to a railway station, buy a ticket and get home, because when a war starts, you have to be at home. While I was thinking like this, the airplanes turned away and flew back to Russia. Later on, I learned that they were carrying bombs, but it was not necessary to drop the bombs, so they returned back home. I was really astonished because Natasha went to the Red Square along with 7 other people, as well as with a 3-month-old baby in a pram. And I really believed, and I was astonished what level of fear she was able to overcome. Obviously, she realized what she was doing. All of them got into prison. Natalia at that time was breastfeeding, so she got into prison a year later. She was held at a psychiatric hospital, a military psychiatric hospital, which was probably worse than a prison. She spent about 2 years there, and then she moved or traveled to France for a couple of years. We could not meet each other because at that time we could not travel. Later on we met in Paris. We didn't plan or organize that meeting. We didn't see each other for about 15 years. After that, we again could communicate, talk to each other, meet each other. Sometimes I traveled to Paris, sometimes she came to see me. And one has to say that Natasha was not able to get rid of the Russian topic. She remained a Russian poetess. She never left those topics and her fields. I used to say her, you keep digging in the garden deeper and deeper, you don't make a single step outside your garden. You know, nature, language, lyrics, that was her field of expertise. She is not a political poet at all. She's a political activist. Last time she really influenced me. Her death really moved me because she was what one can only aspire to. In the evening she had guests. She served a soup, they drank a bit, wrote something on her computer. She was 77 and she didn't wake up in the morning. That's something one can only be envious of. God really blessed her with a wonderful death. And the boy who, when he was 3 months old, was in a pram in the Red Square is now dying of a cancer, and he is 77. It was also a blessing because she had a heart surgery and she needed another one, and she refused that. So she probably died when she planned or when she wished for. She's not with us any longer, but I still feel her. I always keep getting lessons from her. So that's the way we lived. And now on life in the Soviet Union, obviously our life in the Soviet Union had several specifics which one can say were wonderful, because we could survive only with the support of others. We supported each other. I'm not speaking about money which we borrowed from each other before we got our salaries. And we know that whom you had to call if you needed to see a doctor. You know, if you needed to see a doctor, you needed to call somebody to take care of your baby at that time. So we couldn't survive without each other. And that created a very close, almost family-like relations. You know, family members, that's a nonsense. They are given to you by nature. Sometimes your relations with family members are more complicated by friends. Friends are family members whom you have chosen. And indeed, I do have friends with whom I have been close to throughout my life. Alexander Helinsky, for example, we have been friends since we were about 2 years old. So we have been friends for more than 70 years. This is somehow coming to an end in modern society. Social life is getting more and more complicated and vague. But now, when relationships are becoming more and more difficult, complex, something is coming to the surface. We call it the Moscow kitchen. We once again make a cup of tea in our kitchen. And kitchen is the place where we have very live, vivid political discussions. And we try to spend life within the space in a room where we enjoy our life. We follow the principles that our grandparents or our parents outlined. That's a sort of old-fashioned aspect. The link between those 2 years are very important and pronounced, and it's quite difficult to overcome. Although I have become friendly with computers, I see that my younger grandson is very much better. So there is this link, and somehow it's quite difficult to understand younger generation. But what's great that within our generation, we treat our very well. Here I am referring to a younger generation. The conflict between fathers and children has become softer. And you know that in the past, Russian literature touched upon that quite extensively. If we were to imagine the year 1970 at the moment, you were fired from your work, a new chapter of your life you entered into. Did you think that the regime would come to an end one day, or did you think that that's the regime that would be there forever? The one and only Soviet Union.
Это было просто невозможно.
At the time, nobody would have imagined that it would come in an end. It was simply impossible. And even now, it's somehow difficult to understand that it's over. But the way it ended was different from what we thought, because we thought that it would take another course, and the course it has taken was something we have never anticipated. The problem is that the Soviet power has not been overthrown. It simply fell. It fell down as a shabby coat. It wore off, and you cannot give freedom as a gift. You must win it. You must win the freedom over. And the fact that we got it at a very little cost for us, means that we do not cherish it as we should. And this is why it is slipping away from us. You said several times that it is unthinkable and unacceptable for you that you have for such a long time the president or your president is a person who had been a KGB agent, and he even proudly admits he was. So what is the fact that you are meeting again in the kitchen a kind of a reaction to this fact? Is it a response to the fact that we got freedom as a gift, and not only in your country, but in more countries of this part of the world, there seems to be a fascination by an authoritarian ruler that we are not able to somehow take the values of human rights as our own. If I were to speak in the strict sense, there is nothing I would say or I could tell, because you basically answered yourself, your question, because it's a fact what you are saying. I do remember very vividly the days when our friends gathered near the White House with the tanks in the vicinity, and the tanks were rolling over people. And I said, I cannot join them. I'll join them when the Communist Party will be outlawed, and when we'll go through the process that Germany went through. And it seems that I was right, because the decisive step, the ultimate step, was not taken. And as a result, we have found ourselves in this situation. Recently, I've been to Yeltsin's museum at Perm at Yekaterinburg. And one of the exhibits is Yeltsin's speech given on TV when he begs pardon from people. He begs pardon for not having fulfilled the promises he gave. This is the only example in the history of Russia when a person of power begs pardon of people. This is the only and unique deed. Many people take a very positive view of it and of the person Yeltsin. I believe Yeltsin went only halfway. What did he do finally? He handed the country over to a KGB person in order to get a guarantee of security for himself and the security of his family, and also the property of his daughter. And this is not moral, and our problems lie in the moral area. The Soviet power, the Soviet regime was testing people by fear, and the current power is testing people on the feeling of greed. Today's power is not as bloody as in the past. I am very grateful for it, because you can see or hear the things I'm telling here, and I don't have to be afraid to be handcuffed after I come back to the Moscow airport. Josif Brodský is a poet who says that or when he says something like, I find a thief, or I have greater sympathy for a thief than for a murderer, to put it in prose. So today, there are processes that are going on that are horrifying. We all know about them, and the society still has some potential. There are two processes going on, the two trials. Kirill Serebrikov, who is the leader of the Gogol Center, he is a director, and he's been accused of financial crime. And the other one, Yuri Dietra, he is a person who has for the last 30 years researched the mass graves where scores of innocent people were buried. He has thus discovered 3 cemeteries. It is unbelievable what he has done, and he now is a victim of an ugly trial conducted against him. So this is also a test. This is how they are testing us. But we can tolerate this. We can bear it. But unless it gets worse, we can live with it. I can go back home to Russia, and I would really welcome if they, the new rich, left Russia. They live in luxury, they have yachts, their children, for the most part, have already left abroad and live abroad, and after they have eaten all the everything that the oil reserves have provided, they will leave us. That's one of the things I expect to happen.
During the Soviet communism or state capitalism, your heroes helped each other to survive through literature, through culture, through theater. You yourself were actively involved in the Jewish theater in Moscow, which tried to revive that culture which was oppressed in your country. Creativity was a path, a way out of that life in an effort to preserve authentic life. There has been a paradigm, a shift in the Russian Federation. Changes have occurred in economy, in life in the Russian Federation. Could you compare the role of the Russian culture then and now? You know, I'm quite satisfied and happy with Russian culture. That's quite interesting. Sometimes, you know, times are suitable for poets or painters. Currently, that's the time of theater. I'm not saying that nothing else is happening, but I am saying that the theaters are prominent now. Obviously, there is some pressure from the Ministry of Culture at the moment. It's a miserable Ministry of Culture. I don't know what we need it for, because, for example, France doesn't have anything like a Ministry of Culture. Nothing like that exists in the US either. But they do have culture. culture. In those countries, they have a certain mechanism of money distribution for culture. Usually, these are not state or government-owned money, but money from sponsors, donors. I think these are very good ways of financing culture. For example, Kirill Serebrennikov case. He was given some money to set up a Gogol Center. It's a wonderful center. Some 3 days ago, I saw one of the things they put on the stage, although he is held in home prison at the moment. But the theater is working and living. The system of financing is absurd. The current politicians, I'm not talking about our politicians, but also your politicians, American politicians, or politicians across the globe, believe that politics is above culture. They believe that's a higher level of the world. But I believe that it's the other way around. Culture is above politics. It's an illusion that culture can be managed. Culture is self-governing. It lives its own life. Pushkin said it was about a new unknown generation. Currently in Russia, for example, rap culture is extremely popular, although it came from the US, but some other things are coming from the West. And rap culture is a cultural phenomenon. I may like it, I may not like it, I may understand or don't understand it, but rap is a part of culture nowadays, and we have to be very sensitive to it. So I believe that from the point of view of music and lyrics or text, it's miserable, but it works. So don't be snobs. Try to understand what people loving rap think. My generation used to read very comprehensive, demanding literature. We spent our youth reading books which were too demanding, too difficult, even to us. We tried to understand those books and in order to reveal the high truth. Years have passed and you open the book which you used to read in the past, sweating a lot, and you now suddenly understand it. You know, everything is simple, but that's a consequence of our work. That's a result of our work. We read it not because it was fun. It was the quintessence of our life. A good book was very rare. If you got a book to read it overnight, you didn't go to bed just to be able to finish it by the next morning. So it was our early, these were our early years. Nowadays, culture is moving towards audiovisual arts, and we should follow and observe these cultural trends because they are quite interesting. In 1978 to 1981 or 82, I worked in a musical theater, and 2 years ago I wrote lyrics for opera Dr. Gas. I wanted to communicate to my readers on the basis of music. The text was quite good and it was appreciated and awarded a prize. I don't know whether you are familiar with this figure or hero, Dr. Gas. If not, let me outline the story, his story. I think it deserves to be mentioned. At the beginning of the 19th century, Russia invited an outstanding German doctor, physician, Ferdinand Gass. He became a personal doctor of the Tsar. He was an outstanding eye doctor, but also a general surgeon. He was involved in the war in 1812. He treated several noblemen. And sometimes in the 1830s, he became very rich, had, I don't know, 5 houses in Moscow, a plant, a factory not far from Russia, from Moscow, and became the chief doctor of Russian prisons. He accepted that job, and it changed his life profoundly. A few years later, and he didn't have those 5 houses. He didn't have any estate nearby Moscow. He sold everything, and all the money he had, he donated to prisoners. There were so many prisoners at the time. He walked with chains on their hands and feet, 10 people linked through chains and a bar, an iron bar. That's the way they had to walk. So Dr. Gass changed the system, the life of prisoners. They no longer were connected with an iron bar. Chains were replaced by a lighter version. I'm not saying that he changed the system completely, but he became a sort of saint doctor. And he was buried at the cost of the police because at his death he had no money. This year, the Catholic Church beatified him, and we already knew it, that he was a sort of saint. My grandma took me to a German cemetery where my ancestors were buried, and always when we passed the grave of Dr. Gass, she always mentioned the story. 2 years ago, in our theater, we played this modern opera based on his life. Now I'm trying to get involved in the culture of music. I do understand that the current viewers want to communicate through music. And when it comes to culture, I think everything is okay. I believe that the Ministry of Culture will not destroy culture, but sometimes strengthen it. That's the way we live. We think it's normal. There is no censorship for literature, thank God. Books are published. Censorship is very limited to the electronic media, radio and television. Journalists are not allowed to say a single word about the limit or about what is allowed. We don't know how it will proceed, but thank God the current power is not interested in writers, and that makes us happy. You have indicated in relation with Dr. Gass. Now I would like to shift the focus on you. That's a great topic of your prose and of your life. You indicated in the life of your ancestors. You converted to Christianity. Religion plays in your life and in your literature a key role. And you say it clearly. Was it also a way for you to handle your anti-Soviet opinions or ideas? So on the one hand, there is religion and faith. I think there is interference between those two microphones and the headphones. So I can't hear the interpreter properly.
Ja vám rozumiem. Ja pani Majules. Skúsme to prípadne ešte raz, keď poviem tak potišie, že jednoducho by som sa spýtal na úlohu viery vo vašom živote a v písaní kresťanskej viery.
Переводчик на меня обиделся, вообще ничего не говорит. Так, еще раз повторите вопрос по-русски, извините.
Could you repeat the question in English? I think there is interference between the headphones and the microphone used by Mr. Hvorecký at the same time. I think you haven't been able to come up with a more difficult question. I am a religious person. I am a believer. I overcome the limits of various religions. I am a baptized Jew. I spent a lot of time in churches, so I'm pretty familiar with them. And in the last decade, I have been facing a sort of conflict, not with Christianity, but with the official forms of faiths or religions, denominations common at home. So it's been quite a difficult period of time. When I was writing a novel, Daniel Stein, Interpreter, I faced a great dilemma. It was a man strong in his faith, unable to understand Catholic dogmas. He doesn't like certain aspects. He cannot serve. But when he is reading what's acceptable in Christianity, you know, I'm a person who has been always trying to form my religion, and seeing a man like this with all those troubles, I understood that I was free. I am knee-deep in the ruins, but I felt free. So the only thing I keep in myself is a great gratitude when I see beautiful aspects of our life, be it human or other aspects. So this is what makes me truly happy. And I'm not doing very well with the confessional Christianity. I don't like very much strong religions, strict religions. I don't like when people insist on certain things, and I believe those things are minor. You know, to mix milk and meat is a crime. But let me say the crucial thing. We haven't said goodbye. We live the way our lives we are able to live. I don't feel alone. All the official religions, rigid and strong, which are connected with the states, are undergoing a crisis. I might be in a crisis, but that's uncomparable with the crisis of the Russian Orthodox Church or the Catholic Church. Perhaps it's only Buddhists who are not in a crisis because they have quite three structures. So the world should be taken and understood the way it is without being bothered very much. I might be... maybe I haven't answered your question properly. That's why I prefer written interviews to live discussions, because I'm not that apt at spoken.
I have one more question, which is perhaps not as difficult as the theological one. Since the time has advanced and we still need some time for your questions, Ms. Ulitskaya also wanted to have a discussion, so now you have a chance to ask your question. You may put it in Russian, or you may use the mic so that it can be interpreted. Good evening. My first question is related to you being a genetic by profession, by background. Do you believe this is also something that's related to genealogy or the environment? What is the most important determinant of how a person will live his or her life? And what do you think is the fear of people, or in your case, is the fear of a person influenced more by the genetics or the family history or the way you live your life? Zapnite se. The first is the biological component. We have been programmed, and in order to survive, we have to have acute senses so as to avoid danger in order to ensure our progenitor. And as regards the fear also helps us survive. Those who survive are those who know better how to conduct themselves. And this is why in Russia there is a so-called negative genetic selection, because the persons who are better at adapting themselves and those who are above the medium level, or those who were not flexible enough, they were the first to die. But in the persons at the middle level were best at survival. It means that the person who did not distinguish himself or herself from the others had a better chance of survival. This means that the Gaussian curve has become flatter, and which means that the biggest extremes, either on the top or in the bottom, are excluded. The science of genetics also deals with it. We have, of course, new talented people who are much above this median level. They are much higher than is the average level of masses. Today the situation has dramatically changed compared to the last century. The topic of planetary product has emerged. It means that we go to a pharmacy and we get some kind of medicine, but we never know where it was actually produced, whether it was in Hong Kong or in some other country. But they are the so-called planetary scientists. No matter what language they speak, they produce planetary products. the proportion of the planetary products is rising. You can, and also the music and all other things become planetary. In about 3 months' time, I will publish a book. It will appear in a different language, although it was written in Russian, but it is becoming a planetary product in 30 languages. And the people who are able to produce these planetary products maybe among our children. And we have to be happy to have such talented people amongst us. And this negative genetic selection, which was taking place under socialism or communism, you know that academician Landau was eventually pardoned, but huge numbers of other scientists and other talented people did not survive. Herbert Wells had already predicted that the entire mankind will be split into 2 parts. One part will be people living above the ground or on the ground, and those who will live underground will be Morlocks. And these Morlocks would sometime go to the surface and would devour those people who live on the ground. This is a metaphor, and this is a 150-year-old metaphor, but it is starting to display new colors, and it starts to illustrate what we are seeing. There are people who live on really substandard products, but there are other people who work at the CERN Center and develop very advanced products. I, as a as a genetist, I pay a great attention to this development.
Please apologize myself. I haven't spoken Russian for almost 20 years. I may not able to express myself properly in Russian. So my question is as follows. It's about KGB archives. You mentioned that you worked in those archives. You had the opportunity to read the files they kept on your grandfather. My question is, are those KGB archives open? May I, as a journalist, come to Russia, to Moscow, and get there and read those files? I got your answer, question. I had the opportunity to read the file because he's a close relative, a direct relative, bearing the same surname. Otherwise, they would require documents proving my family link. So relatives do have access to family relatives and their files. So those archives were open for some time. Ukraine has opened their archives recently. It's a difficult situation. Currently, the power authorities are trying to shut the archives down, but the archives are there, and that's a great achievement. Some parts of them have been destroyed. There was some period of time when they destroyed the files. Why? Because members of the memorial company dealing with this could answer your question properly. The names of victims are more or less known. every year on the 29th of October in Moscow, at the place where the Dzerzhinsky monument used to be erected. They read the list of people who were executed in the 1930s. The names of executioners are not known, although some of them were executed themselves. So there was a system which tried to keep those files in silence. A few years ago, we experienced an interesting story. A young historian from Siberia, I think he came from the city of Tuberg, whose grandfather was executed. He found some documents. His grandfather was a kulak, a rich private farmer. And there was a group of rich private farmers who were executed, and the historian discovered a full list of the executed persons, as well as the names of firing squads. There were 5 executioners, including one woman, and he published all these documents, and it was received with a great fear among some. The same thing happened in Lithuania, where a journalist published a book in which she described how Lithuanian Jews were deported and executed. Lithuania was occupied by the Nazi soldiers who continued moving. Only 600 German soldiers were left in the country. 5,000 people, local people, were involved in those executions. These were volunteers, local volunteers, with great pleasure executed their Jewish neighbors. This book shook the society. Currently, the journalist is persecuted in the country because her uncle was involved in this mass execution, the annihilation. It's a very complicated family story. In a few days, I'm going to Vilnius. And I already had a roundtable discussion with another journalist who had published some documents, very difficult documents. But if we do not publish these stories, if we are not able to process them as a nation, things like this may happen again. Maybe it won't be Jews, it may be somebody else. Somebody may decide that all jazz lovers or fair-headed or crippled people have to be killed. Liberals are not popular in Russia nowadays. They call them liberasti. There is some despise towards certain groups. For example, Russia is extremely homophobic. There is a great wave of anti-gay propaganda. In Russia, many gays are leaving Russia in great numbers. And this kind of readiness of large groups is difficult. The only thing which we can do is to act on the basis of knowledge we get from books and readings. Otherwise, we will go back to the medieval ages. Many of things you have referred to are very pertinent to Slovakia as well. Now a question from the first row. May I ask for interpretation? Thank you very much for joining us here in Central Europe. The presence and the future of Russia is a great topic. Some journalists and some thinkers from time to time indicate that Russia is a country suitable that Russia is not suitable for liberal democracy to which we are used in this part of the world, that, for example, Kazakhstan, where everything is working more or less properly. Do you think that this type of freedom or democracy cannot get rooted there? Unfortunately, Madam Ulitskaya is not speaking to the microphone, so we are not in a position to interpret it.
Hovorte, nech sa páči, môžete položiť svoju otázku.
A few years ago, I wrote an article called Goodbye Europe. Russia is in a swing move. The first stimulus was given by Peter when he brought European knowledge and education into Russia. Many Russians traveled to Europe and brought back, and he taught archaic education. Then it swung back, and life is like a pendulum. Once it's closer, otherwise sometimes it's closer, sometimes it's far away from Europe. And it seems to me that history shows us that we will get back closer to Europe one day, because the other way is so-called Euro-Asian, a unique third way, saying that we are not true Europeans, but we are something between Europe and Asia. It's a concept that hasn't proven to work very well. But I believe that it may take some time, but Russia will set on the pro-European path. When and at what cost, we don't know. To us, sooner or later, it will get to Russia. For example, the Islamic world. First time I got there, or rather the only time I got there, and in a hotel I saw the date 1475, if I'm not mistaken, at the hotel reception. And at the moment I got frozen, literally frozen. The Islamic world was living with that civilization delay. It's making its progress, catching fast, making up for the lost time. Girls are getting to universities, but they are covered from from head to toes. But they are getting to universities, shedding their clothes, wearing jeans and T-shirts. So that's a progress with a 100-year delay. But when you are trying to overcome it, I think you will overcome it. So what's important is not money or some financial capital injections, but rather understanding. Our consciousness and understanding has made a significant progress over the last 100 years. Obviously, there are numerous problems in the education, radio or TV sectors trying to spread propaganda, but I might be a strong optimist. There is room for the last two questions as we are pressed for time. So.
Či áno, tu v druhom rade. Prosím, môžeme poprosiť mikrofón do druhého radu. Ďakujem.
Я тоже не очень хорошо говорю.
Ani ja nehovorím po rusky veľmi dobre.
I cannot speak Russian very well because it's been a long time that I last spoke Russian. I have a question concerning your books.
45.
I have the book, the Childhood, 1953, 1945. I got this book at a book fair in Budapest last year, and I liked the book very much. But I have heard that you also have another book. You wrote another book like Childhood, 1949.
Som veľmi skromný,
I'm a
nesmelý človek a
very modest and timid person, and it took me a long time before I started writing. I prepared material for the theater, for children's play, and the Childhood, 1949, contains stories for children. It is a beautifully made book. It has very good graphic side, and it was illustrated by a very good artist. It is a book where I remember my childhood, the 1940s, and it also mentions the memories of my childhood. When I wrote it, it was as if I lived my childhood for the second time. So I first wrote this childhood book, then later on I wrote more books, but the one was media in the children. I also wrote a book that evoked my profession, genetics, and then I wrote Daniel Stein, Interpreter, where I handled a religious theme. And the Childhood, 1949, is a book that made it possible for me to go back to my first childhood impressions. You mentioned that theater director who was imprisoned. I don't know whether it was in the past or whether it is something that's happening now. Could you please elaborate on it? He is currently in custody, and he's under house arrest. His name is Kirill Serebrennikov. He is a very famous theater director. Initially, he worked at a theater which was not of a very high quality, but he transformed the theater into an unbelievable cultural center. I've been there quite recently. He's under house arrest, but the theater goes on performing. He is accused of some financial violations, but all of these are accusations that are false, made up. The Ministry of Culture and the system of culture itself suffers from many shortcomings. The reason is that the state allocates money not in cash. So, and the bureaucrats want those who are allocated the grants and the state money to pay back or to give back a certain part of that money. So it means it is a kind of a kickback. So everybody is basically guilty, because if you want to, the idea is that if you want to get some money, you will have to give some of it back. And the problem number one is that everybody is getting money from the state, and I hope that Kirill will be eventually released. This is an unfortunate situation. We are all unhappy about it. And when the last day of shooting a film about our singer was filmed, we at that time said farewell to each other. And then when I went back to Moscow the next time, I learned that he was already imprisoned. And then there is a problem concerning Konstantin Raikin. He is an excellent and talented director, film director. This is another scandal, and he is also being blamed or accused of financial crime, only to silence him up. We do not have a literary censorship, properly speaking. You can say or write anything about the power holders, and it will be published. But this is not because our power holders would be as generous, but because they know that a lot is being written, and they also know that those who write their works are not any, it's not any new Tolstoy or a new literary giant.
And we have time for the very last question tonight. Who would dare? I'm sure that you will speak wonderful, spotless Russian. So thank you very much for coming to Slovakia. It's a great honor for us. Maybe the previous question was better than my last question. If I may, I would come back from literature back to politics. Speaking about presidential elections. I'm thinking and referring to the upcoming presidential election in Russia. Putin has been silent for the time being, hasn't announced his intention to run for presidency, although we know that he will do it, and what is to happen will happen. Despite that, Ksenia Sobchakova has announced his intention to run for presidency. What's your opinion of Putin having an opponent, a young woman? What do you think about that? I have been thinking about that very little, because I believe that Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin will remain on this throne till the very last day of his life. That's a clearer picture. But if I'm wrong, if it turns out that I'm wrong, it will make me very, very happy. It may be I will be wrong, and we will get even a stronger, a better KGB guy, and the things will turn even worse. Thank you very much.